No raised voices, no snarling guard dogs straining at leashes, no hands lifted in preparation to strike. The group of German women exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through them like wind moving across a wheat field. Greta felt her chest constricting, breath becoming difficult. This had to be performance, she told herself. The calm before the true horror revealed itself. Americans were clever, everyone knew that. This was probably some psychological strategy, lulling them into false security before the real punishment began. The processing took nearly an hour, each woman photographed and assigned an identification number, given a set of basic supplies and directed to a bunk in one of the wooden barracks that smelled strongly of fresh-cut pine and desert dust. Greta stood beside the narrow bed she'd been assigned and stared down at the thin mattress covering it. An actual mattress, the first real bed she'd encountered in weeks of transit and temporary holding. Her throat seemed to close around itself. Resting on the pillow was a bar of soap, ivory brand, pristine white and clean as something from a dream that couldn't possibly be real. She picked it up carefully, turned it over in her hands, kept expecting it to crumble into ash or reveal itself as some cruel illusion. "Where are the whips?" Anna Schultz whispered from the bunk beside hers, her voice thin and cracking. She was the youngest of their group at 19, barely more than a girl. "Where are the dogs? Where are the cages?" Nobody could answer her because they were all thinking variations of the same question, all waiting for the moment when this strange performance would end and the promised brutality would finally arrive. The dinner bell rang at exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, and Greta found herself filing into a mess hall behind the other women, shoulders tight with tension, jaw clenched in preparation for whatever awaited them there. She'd been ready for watery soup, maybe, or mouldy bread crusts, the kind of starvation rations her grandmother had warned about. Instead, the smell that hit her when she stepped through the door almost made her knees buckle. Roasting meat, she could identify that immediately. Yeast and butter. Coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz grain mixture they'd been drinking in Germany for years. Her stomach clenched so violently she actually bent forward slightly, one hand pressed against her abdomen. The man standing behind the serving line was broad and friendly-looking, with the kind of open face that suggested he smiled easily and often. He said something in English she couldn't understand, words flowing together in a rhythm she hadn't learned yet, then gestured toward the stack of metal trays with an encouraging motion. Greta held hers out with both hands, shaking so badly she worried she might drop it. He began loading food onto it, and she watched in complete disbelief as the portions grew. A thick slab of beef roast, cooked so the centre remained slightly pink, the kind of meat she hadn't seen in years. Mashed potatoes with an actual pat of yellow butter melting into them, turning parts of the white potato to gold. Green beans that looked fresh. A dinner roll still giving off steam when she touched it experimentally with one finger. Canned peaches swimming in heavy syrup. The tray grew heavy in her hands, and she stood there frozen, unable to make herself move, unable to process what she was seeing. "This is American prison food," she heard herself whisper in German, the words barely making it past her lips. "This is what they give to prisoners?" Liesl Weber appeared at her shoulder so suddenly Greta flinched. At 38, Liesl was the oldest in their group, hard-faced and harder-voiced, a former SS auxiliary who'd been issuing orders and expecting obedience since the moment they'd all been loaded onto the transport truck together. She moved with the kind of aggressive certainty that came from never questioning anything, never allowing doubt to slow her down. Now she reached out and slapped the fork from Greta's hand with enough force to send it clattering across the floor, the metal sound sharp in the relatively quiet mess hall. "Don't touch it," Liesl hissed, her voice low and urgent and absolutely certain. "It's poisoned, obviously. They want us to think we're safe, to believe this is real, and then—" She drew one finger across her throat in a gesture that needed no translation, the movement sharp and final as a blade. "They're playing with us like cats with mice, testing us to see how stupid we are. The real punishment comes after we're foolish enough to trust them. Greta's heart hammered against her ribs, pulse roaring in her ears. It made perfect sense, she thought. Of course it made sense. Everything she'd been taught, every warning she'd absorbed, every story she'd heard about American savagery, all of it said you didn't feed your captured enemies prime beef unless you were fattening them for some worse fate. This had to be psychological torture, had to be manipulation, had to be anything other than what it appeared to be. But then Lieutenant Tanaka sat down across the table from them, setting her own tray down with a quiet click of metal on wood. The food on her plate looked identical to what Greta held, matched down to the last green bean, the same portion sizes, the same quality. She picked up her knife and fork with calm, economical movements, cut into her beef with practiced precision, lifted a piece to her mouth, chewed, swallowed. Her dark eyes met Greta's over the table, and she said in that same level, perfectly accented German, Geneva Convention, Article 26. Prisoners of war shall receive the same daily food rations as troops of the captor nation garrisoned in the same area. You're welcome to review the Red Cross inspection report if you'd like verification. It's posted on the bulletin board in your barracks. Greta felt the entire world tilt beneath her feet, felt everything she'd understood about reality sliding sideways into some new configuration she didn't have words for yet. If they'd lied about this, about something so fundamental as food and treatment and basic survival, then what else had been lies? What else had she believed without question that might crumble under examination? That night, long after the lights had been turned off in the barracks, after most of the other women had fallen into exhausted sleep, Greta reached into her pocket and pulled out the small piece of beef she'd saved. She'd hidden it in her sleeve without quite knowing why, some instinct making her preserve it like contraband, like evidence of something she couldn't yet name. In the darkness, with Liesel's disapproving presence a weight she could feel from across the room, even though the older woman never made a sound, Greta lifted the cold meat to her mouth. It tasted like treason, like betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe. It tasted like truth might taste if truth could be eaten. And afterward, when tears came without permission, she couldn't have said whether she was crying from relief or grief or the terrible confusion of having her entire understanding of the world shattered by a single meal. By the time a full week had passed, Greta found herself holding $3.60 in camp scrip, thin paper vouchers printed with the Camp Florence seal, more actual money than she'd ever possessed at one time in her entire life in Germany. The work they'd assigned her wasn't difficult. Mostly laundry duty that meant hauling wet uniforms from enormous industrial washing machines to the clotheslines stretched across the compound, spending 8 hours a day with her hands turning pink in hot water, 80 cents per day for 8 hours of work. The mathematics of it felt absurd, impossible, like something from a story rather than reality. On Saturday, when they were allowed to visit the camp canteen, she bought toothpaste. Real Colgate in a metal tube, the kind of luxury she'd almost forgotten existed. Writing paper, smooth and clean and waiting to be filled. A pencil with soft lead that made dark marks. She stood at the counter, touching each item as though it might burn her or vanish like smoke, kept waiting for someone to laugh and snatch everything away, to reveal that this too was part of the game, the long, cruel setup before the punchline of punishment arrived. But the clerk, a bored-looking corporal who barely glanced up from whatever paperwork occupied his attention, simply accepted her scrip and waved her along without comment. Anna Schultz bought cigarettes even though she'd never smoked in her life, clutched the pack like a talisman against unreality, physical proof that this strange new existence hadn't dissolved yet. Greta found herself watching Lieutenant Tanaka constantly now, studying the woman the way you might study a locked door, searching for the hidden mechanism that would explain how it opened, what made it work. Sarah moved through the camp with mechanical efficiency, that clipboard always in hand, enforcing rules with the same flat consistency whether the infraction was minor or serious. No raised voice, no favoritism, no deviation from whatever internal standard she'd set for herself. When a guard tried to skip giving a German prisoner her dessert portion as what he clearly thought was a harmless joke, Sarah reassigned him to night watch duty for an entire month without any visible emotion. When Liesel was caught hoarding bread in her footlocker, building up some secret store against the starvation she still insisted must be coming eventually, Sarah confiscated everything and logged the incident in triplicate, her face showing nothing but professional detachment. What Greta couldn't understand, what kept her awake some nights trying to work through the logic of it, was the restraint. Sarah should hate them, should want them to suffer, should take every opportunity to make their lives miserable within whatever boundaries the regulations allowed. Greta had overheard guards talking one evening, their voices carrying across the compound. Casual conversation about how Sarah's parents had been sent to some internment camp in California, their grocery store confiscated, 30 years of building a life just erased in the space of a week. About how her younger brother had enlisted to prove his loyalty, to demonstrate that Japanese Americans were real Americans, and had died with an Italian bullet in his chest at a place called Anzio, had come home in a flag-draped coffin after giving everything to prove he belonged. Yet here Sarah stood, enforcing the Geneva Convention like it was religious scripture, treating enemy women with a care that somehow felt more disturbing than cruelty ever could have been. There was no heat in it, no emotion, just mechanical compliance with a set of rules that apparently mattered more to her than personal feeling or reasonable desire for revenge. One evening, Sarah discovered Greta sitting alone in the barracks while the other women had gone to the recreation hall for a film screening. Greta had meant to go with them, had even stood up and started toward the door, but found herself unable to make her feet keep moving, unable to do anything except sit on her bunk, staring at a blank piece of writing paper with a pencil hovering uselessly above it. "Writer's block?" Sarah asked in that precisely accented German, her phrasing oddly formal in a way that suggested she'd learned the language from textbooks rather than conversation. Greta looked up, startled by the question. "I don't know what to say," she answered honestly. "To my family, assuming they're even," she stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to give voice to the possibility that there might be no one left to read whatever she wrote. "Truth is usually a good place to start," Sarah said. The words came without inflection, just another statement of fact. "The truth is, I'm being treated better here than I ever was at home," Greta heard herself say, the words emerging sharp and almost angry, surprising her with their bitterness. "The truth is, I eat steak while they're probably starving, assuming they're alive at all. How am I supposed to write that? How do I explain that in a letter?" Sarah remained quiet for what felt like a long time, then reached into the bag she carried and produced a small cloth-bound book, its cover worn soft at the edges from handling. "German-English dictionary," she said, setting it on the bunk beside Greta with careful placement. "I thought you might want to read the convention yourself, word by word, article by article. It's not mercy we're showing you, it's law. There's a difference between those things." Greta picked up the dictionary slowly, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the reality of it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" Sarah replied. "Treating us like we're human beings instead of," she gestured vaguely, "instead of what we are." "What you are is prisoners of war," Sarah said, and her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, some flicker of emotion quickly suppressed. "And the law says prisoners of war are human beings entitled to certain treatment. The minute I stop following that law, the minute I let personal feeling override it, I become the thing I'm supposed to be fighting against." She turned to leave, her steps measured and precise as always, then paused in the doorway without looking back. "Your family would want to know you're alive," she said. "Write that first. Everything else can wait until later." After she left, Greta opened the dictionary, the pages smelling of ink and aging paper, that particular scent of old books. She started with basics, simple words she thought she might need. "Hello, thank you, please," but found herself drawn to other entries, flipping pages to find words she couldn't have explained her need for. restraint, justice, mercy. She sounded each one out quietly, testing the shapes in her mouth, feeling how the English differed from German in emphasis and flow. By the end of that second week, she'd started teaching basic English to some of the younger prisoners in exchange for their dessert rations, a barter system that seemed to satisfy everyone involved. Anna proved to be her best student, absorbing vocabulary with frightening speed, her young mind hungry for something to occupy itself with beyond fear and uncertainty. Even Liesel showed up once, standing at the back of the barracks with arms crossed over her chest, listening but never participating, never asking questions or acknowledging that she was learning anything. "Why are you learning their language?" Liesel demanded one night, her voice cutting through the darkness after lights had been turned off and everyone was supposed to be sleeping. "Why are you trying to understand them, trying to become like them?" Greta didn't answer immediately, thinking about the dictionary with its worn cover, about Sarah's mechanical kindness that somehow hurt worse than cruelty would have, about that first piece of steak that had tasted like treason. "Because I want to understand what they're saying," she finally replied into the darkness, "when they tell us why. Why they're doing this, why they're treating us this way, why any of this is happening." "There is no why," Liesel shot back, her voice hard as stone. "There's only waiting until we can go home, until this is over and we can return to what's real." But Greta wasn't sure anymore what home even meant, wasn't sure if there was anything real left to return to, wasn't sure about anything except that the ground beneath her feet had shifted in ways she was still trying to map. 3 months passed like water running through open fingers, like sand pouring through an hourglass. Greta learned to sleep through the night without startling awake at every small sound, learned to eat without checking her food for poison first, learned the English words for sunrise and coffee and good morning and how to say them to the mess sergeant Jimmy Mueller when he handed her breakfast with that same gentle smile every morning. The camp settled into routines that began to feel almost normal, work details and mail calls and evening recreation time, until the day Lieutenant Tanaka gathered all the German women without warning and marched them to the camp theatre without offering any explanation. The room was small and close, folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a white screen stretched across one wall. A film projector sat in the back already threaded with film and humming quietly. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her face carved from stone, harder somehow than Greta had ever seen it. "Victory in Europe Day happened 2 weeks ago," she said in German, her voice carrying absolutely no inflection whatsoever, each word dropped like a stone into still water. "The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. What you're about to see are newsreel films from the Allied liberation of concentration camps. You will watch all of it. You will not be permitted to leave early." Greta's stomach dropped sickeningly. Beside her, Anna had gone white as paper, her breathing suddenly quick and shallow. The lights dimmed. The projector clicked to life with a mechanical rattle. Bergen-Belsen appeared on screen first, and Greta found herself looking at mountains of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, human beings reduced to bundles of sticks with skin stretched over them, limbs twisted at impossible angles. Living prisoners who looked like animated corpses moved across the frame, hollow-eyed and swaying as though a strong wind might knock them over. British soldiers wearing cloth masks against the stench used bulldozers to push the dead into enormous mass graves while the camera recorded everything with pitiless clarity. Then came Dachau, then Buchenwald, then Auschwitz. Each one worse than the last, each one revealing new depths of horror Greta's mind kept trying to reject as impossible, as exaggeration, as enemy propaganda. She made it through perhaps 15 minutes before she stumbled up the aisle toward the side door, one hand clamped over her mouth, her whole body shaking. She barely made it to the edge of the building before her stomach emptied itself violently onto the desert sand. She retched until there was nothing left inside her, then kept retching anyway, her body trying to expel something that couldn't be vomited away, trying to purge itself of knowledge that had already taken root. She didn't hear Sarah approach, didn't know the lieutenant was there until her shadow fell across the ground beside Greta's kneeling form. "Did you know?" Sarah asked quietly. "About this, about what was happening?" "No," Greta managed, her voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "I didn't know. We didn't know. I never saw anything like that, never heard anyone talk about." She stopped, because the excuse was dying in her throat even as she tried to form it. "I was just a radio operator. I just relayed messages and coordinates and supply requests, and—" she stopped again. "But I should have asked, should have wondered, should have thought about why they needed so many trains running to so many camps, why there were always more camps, always more transports. I should have—" "What?" she wanted to scream. Should have asked questions, should have looked harder at what was happening around her, should have refused orders. What could one radio operator have done? What difference would her single refusal have made against the machinery of an entire state? But she'd never even tried, had never even thought to try. Sarah stood silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its mechanical edge, had gained something almost human underneath. "My parents lost their grocery store in San Francisco," she said. "Everything they'd built in 30 years, gone in a single week. My brother Carl enlisted to prove loyalty, to show everyone that we were real Americans, that we belonged here. He died at Anzio with a bullet through his chest and came home in a flag-draped coffin." She looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening desert sky. "I wanted to hate every single one of you. Wanted you to suffer the way my family suffered, the way those people in those camps suffered. Wanted to make you feel even a fraction of that pain." Greta couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only kneel in the sand and listen. "But the law said you're human beings," Sarah continued, her voice steady and controlled. "The Geneva Convention said you get the same food I eat, the same medical care, the same basic dignity. So I had to act like that was true, even when I didn't feel it, even when every part of me wanted to." She stopped, swallowed hard. "Restraint isn't kindness. It's not forgiveness. It's just the only thing standing between civilization and that." She gestured back toward the theatre building where the projector was still running, still showing footage of horrors beyond naming. Greta wanted desperately to say something, wanted to apologize or explain or beg forgiveness, but what apology could possibly be adequate? What words existed that could span the distance between what she'd believed and what she now knew to be true? 2 weeks after that, the German women organized a small concert in the recreation hall. Someone had discovered an old upright piano shoved into a corner, out of tune but functional. Sarah played it, badly, hitting wrong notes and laughing at her own mistakes with something approaching actual warmth, while the German women sang folk songs their grandmothers had taught them when they were children. Nothing political, nothing martial, just songs about mountains and rivers and seasons changing, about homesickness and longing and simple human feeling. Even Liesel softened slightly that night, pulling out photographs of her 2 children from some hidden pocket and passing them around with hands that trembled, her face cracking just slightly to show the mother underneath the hard shell. For one strange hour they existed not as prisoners and guards, but simply as women trying to remember what it felt like to be human, trying to grasp at connection across the vast gulf the war had carved. That night, Greta wrote another letter home, her 12th attempt, or perhaps her 15th. She'd lost count. She'd written so many by this point, all of them unanswered, all of them vanishing into the void of a collapsed postal system and a devastated country. She folded the paper with meticulous care, addressed it in her neatest handwriting, said simply that she was safe, that she was being treated well, that she hoped desperately that someone was alive to read this message. She never expected a response, had stopped expecting responses weeks ago. But 3 days later, the Red Cross envelope arrived. It was thin, far too thin. Greta held it between her fingers in the barracks, feeling the weight of absence inside it, feeling how little it contained. Red Cross letterhead with official stamps and markings. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she tore it open carefully along the seam. The words on the page swam in her vision, refused to hold still or make sense. She had to read them 3 times before her brain would accept what her eyes were telling her. Her mother and younger brother were dead, killed in the February firebombing of Dresden, their bodies never recovered from the firestorm that had consumed entire city blocks. Her father was listed as missing, last seen in the chaos of the Soviet advance through eastern Germany, presumed dead though no remains had been found. Her grandmother, that fierce old woman who'd gripped her face at the Munich station and warned her to die with honour, had hanged herself in the garden shed 2 days after hearing about Germany's surrender, unable to face the ruin of everything she'd believed in, choosing death over living in a world where the Reich had failed. The war had ended months ago now, but the letter had taken this long to reach her through destroyed infrastructure and overwhelmed relief organisations. Greta folded the letter back up with mechanical precision, creased it along the original lines with perfect exactness, her hands moving on their own while her mind went somewhere else entirely. Her grandmother had chosen death over dishonour, just as she'd promised she would. And meanwhile, Greta had been here learning English, singing folk songs with the enemy, eating steak and sleeping in an actual bed and allowing herself to feel something close to gratitude. Jimmy Mueller noticed first at dinner that evening. He approached her table with concern creasing his broad face, his expression worried in that open American way. "You need to eat something, miss," he said in his limited German. "Please, you need to keep your strength up." She stared down at the steak on her plate. It might as well have been made of ash and dust. That night, Liesl cornered her in the barracks, waiting until most of the other women had settled into their bunks. The older woman's face was hard as flint, her eyes blazing with something between fury and vindication. "I told you," she hissed in rapid German, her voice low but intense. "I told you they were playing games with us, manipulating us, making us comfortable so they could break us more completely. Now you see it, don't you? You understand now what they've done? They fed you while your family died in the rubble. They gave you beds and soap and English lessons while Germany burned. They turned you into a traitor." "I never," Greta started, but her voice wouldn't work properly, the words sticking in her throat. "You befriended her," Liesl continued relentlessly. "That Japanese woman. You learned their language like an eager student. You laughed at their piano playing. You sat at their tables and ate their food and smiled like this was all normal." Liesl's voice rose, sharp enough to cut through the darkness. "You chose them over your own people, over your own blood." "That's not what," Greta tried again. "You're a collaborator," Liesl spat the word like a curse. "A disgrace to everything we were raised to be. Your grandmother killed herself because she understood what honour looks like, and you—" She paused, her contempt palpable in the air between them. "You make me sick." Something broke loose inside Greta's chest, some dam that had been holding back 3 months of confusion and grief and guilt. She launched herself at Liesl with no thought, no plan, just pure animal need to hurt something, to make the world hurt the way she hurt. Her fists swung wildly, connecting with something solid. They crashed into a bunk together, tangled and struggling. Anna and 2 other women tried to pull them apart, voices raised in alarm. Greta felt a fist connect with her jaw, tasted copper blood in her mouth, didn't care, kept fighting, kept screaming words that didn't form coherent sentences. Guards flooded into the barracks within seconds, strong hands dragging her away from Liesl. She was still screaming when they locked her in the isolation cell, a small concrete room containing only a narrow cot and a metal bucket and nothing else. The door slammed shut, and the silence that followed pressed down like a physical weight, crushing and absolute. For 3 days she sat in that cell and faced the question she'd been running from since the newsreels, since the letter, since that first bite of steak 3 months ago. Did being treated with mercy while her family died make her complicit in their deaths? Did surviving when they hadn't mean she'd betrayed everything she was supposed to be? Was feeling gratitude the same as committing treason? The concrete walls had no answers, just threw her questions back at her in the form of echoes. On the third day, Sarah came to the cell door. She didn't unlock it, just sat down on the floor outside with her back against the bars, and spoke through the gap between them. "I received the report about your family," she said quietly, her voice gentle in a way Greta had never heard it before. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know those words are inadequate, but I mean them." Greta said nothing. What could she possibly say that would matter? "You didn't kill them," Sarah continued after a moment. "You didn't drop the bombs, or plan the invasion, or start the war, or vote for any of it. You were 22 years old and following orders because that's what you were taught to do, what you were raised to do, what everyone around you was doing." "I should have been there," Greta finally said, her voice cracking. "I should have been there with them." "To die with them?" Sarah asked. "Would that actually have made anything better, or would it just mean 4 deaths instead of 3? "It would have been honest," Greta replied. "Instead, I'm here, safe and fed and alive, while they—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't put words to the enormity of the injustice. Sarah remained quiet for a long moment. "You didn't choose to be captured," she finally said. "You didn't choose to be given food. You didn't choose this treatment. But you can choose what to do with the fact that you survived when they didn't." She stood up, brushing dust from her uniform with brisk movements. "People are going to need bridges," she said, "between languages and cultures and enemies, between the world that existed and the world that has to be built now. You can be part of building those bridges if you want to be, or you can let the guilt consume you until there's nothing left. But either way, your family is still gone and you're still here, and you have to decide what that means." Her footsteps echoed down the corridor as she walked away, leaving Greta alone again with the silence. Greta curled up on the thin mattress and finally allowed herself to cry properly. Not the silent tears she'd shed before, but great wrenching sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping for air, crying until she was empty, until there was nothing left inside except the terrible, unbearable fact of her own continued existence and the question of what to do with it now. They released her on a Wednesday morning. She walked back to the barracks with her jaw still tender from Liesel's fist, her hands still shaking with aftershocks of grief and rage. She found the other women beginning preparations for repatriation, packing what few belongings they'd accumulated, preparing for the journey that would send them back to occupied Germany. The camp was processing them in waves, organising transport ships that would carry them across the Atlantic to dock at Hamburg or Bremen, depositing them back into a country most of them no longer recognised. Most of the women seemed terrified rather than relieved. Anna sat on her bunk, clutching a single photograph of her family home, now reduced to rubble in the bombing, crying so quietly the sound barely carried. "There's nothing to go back to," she whispered when Greta sat down beside her. "No house left standing, no family waiting, no jobs to return to. Just ruins and starvation and soldiers everywhere." She looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "At least here we're human beings. At least here we have beds and food and nobody." She stopped, unable to finish. Liesel stood by the window with her arms crossed, staring out at the desert landscape. "We should have stayed prisoners," she said bitterly without turning around. "It's the only safe place left for any of us. There's nothing out there but ash and blame." Greta felt hollow, scooped out and empty, like someone had removed everything vital from inside her chest and left only the shell functioning. She had no family to return to, no home waiting, no identity beyond the lies she'd been taught and the mercy she still couldn't fully understand or accept. She moved through the days like a ghost inhabiting her own body, doing her assigned work mechanically, eating because Sarah watched her with those steady dark eyes until she managed at least a few bites of each meal. A week after her release from isolation, Sarah found her in the laundry room and handed her an envelope without preamble. "The Red Cross needs a translator," Sarah said in that matter-of-fact tone. "German refugee woman in Tucson trying to locate her daughter. She lost track of her somewhere between Munich and the Swiss border during the evacuation. I told them you might be willing to help. Greta stared at the letter inside, written in shaky German script that showed the writer's age and desperation. A mother's plea, full of specific details that only someone who'd actually raised this child could know. The daughter's birth date, the colour of her winter coat, a distinctive scar on her left hand from a kitchen accident when she was 7. The kind of intimate knowledge that authenticated the request beyond any doubt. I don't know how to, Greta started. You read and write German fluently, Sarah interrupted. You're learning English quickly. You understand how bureaucratic systems function now, how paperwork moves through channels. It's not redemption, she added, her voice softer. I can't offer you that, but it's something real you can do, something that might actually help someone. Greta took the letter carefully, carried it back to the barracks, spent 3 hours that evening translating it with meticulous care, adding detailed notes about where to search, which aid agencies to contact, what specific paperwork would be required at each stage. She walked it back to Sarah's office after lights out, slid it under the door, and returned to her bunk feeling something she couldn't quite name stirring in her chest. 2 days later, another letter arrived requesting help, then another the day after that. Word had spread somehow through the Displaced Persons Network. There was a German prisoner of war at Camp Florence who could help with missing persons cases, who understood both languages well enough to navigate between them, who could translate desperate searches into forms that bureaucracies could process. Greta began spending her evenings translating requests, writing letters, filling out the endless forms that might reconnect families torn apart by war's chaos. Small acts that felt hopelessly inadequate against an ocean of suffering, but real nonetheless, concrete and achievable. One evening, Sarah brought her a follow-up message. The mother in Tucson had found her daughter through Greta's translated paperwork, located her in a displaced persons camp outside Stuttgart. They'd been reunited after 8 months of searching. The mother's thank you letter, translated by someone else now, expressed gratitude so profound it made Greta's eyes sting. She read that letter 3 times, then 4 times, then pressed her palm hard against her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. One person, one single thread reconnected in the vast torn fabric of Europe. It shouldn't have mattered against everything else, against the millions dead and displaced and destroyed. But somehow it did matter, made some tiny difference in the crushing weight of guilt and grief she carried. A Red Cross worker visited the camp 2 weeks before repatriation operations began in earnest. She was a tall, efficient woman with kind eyes who moved like someone accustomed to working in difficult conditions. She was recruiting staff for displaced persons relief operations across Europe, needed German speakers desperately, people who could help survivors navigate the complex aid systems, fill out endless paperwork, locate missing relatives, translate trauma into the kinds of forms that bureaucracies required before they could provide help. It's not glamorous work, the woman warned, addressing the gathered prisoners in careful formal German. Long hours in difficult conditions dealing with heartbreaking cases every single day. No one will thank you for it. Most people won't even know you're doing it. But if you want to help rebuild something from all this destruction, this is where that work starts. One family at a time, one reconnection at a time, one piece of paperwork at a time. Greta sat in the back of the room during this recruitment talk. Sarah stood against the wall nearby, her face unreadable as always. Their eyes met across the space. Sarah gave one small nod, barely perceptible, carrying no pressure but somehow communicating permission or perhaps understanding. That night, Greta pulled out her German-English dictionary and looked up the word she needed. Purpose. She sounded it out quietly in the darkness, testing the shape of it in her mouth, feeling how it differed from the German equivalent. When the Red Cross worker asked for volunteers the following morning, asking who might be willing to stay in America and work for the relief organization rather than returning to Germany, Greta raised her hand without allowing herself time to think about it, to second-guess, to retreat back into safety. Liesel watched from across the room, her expression completely unreadable. "You're still choosing them," she said later when they were alone. "Still turning your back on your own people, on everything you were supposed to be." "No," Greta replied quietly, meeting the older woman's eyes without flinching. "I'm choosing the people who need help. That includes my own people. That includes everyone who's suffering. That's what I'm choosing." The day before repatriation operations began, all the women who were leaving were asked to sign official statements about their treatment for Red Cross documentation purposes. Liesel refused, still clinging fiercely to her belief that it had all been theatre, psychological manipulation, warfare by other means. But Greta sat at the small desk with a pen and wrote in careful English, choosing each word with deliberate precision. "I arrived expecting cruelty and received steak instead. I expected savagery and was given law. I expected hatred and witnessed restraint. I do not fully understand mercy yet, may never understand it completely, but I saw it practiced here by people who had every reason to choose revenge instead. I will spend whatever remains of my life learning to pass that forward, to build bridges where there were only walls, to choose law over feeling when feeling would lead to more suffering. I can't redeem what was done. I can only try to do better with what comes next." She signed her name at the bottom in clear letters, slid the paper across the desk to Sarah, who read it without any visible reaction, then looked up and held Greta's gaze for a long moment. The silence between them felt full of things neither could say, acknowledgements and griefs and strange, fragile hopes for futures that might be possible if enough people chose restraint over revenge. "Good luck," Sarah finally said, her voice carrying warmth for perhaps the first time since they'd met. "Thank you," Greta replied in English, the words still awkward in her mouth but sincere, "for showing me what law looks like when it's practiced instead of just proclaimed." 3 days later, Greta stood at the camp gates with a small bag containing everything she owned, waiting for the transport that would take her to her first assignment, helping displaced persons in a processing centre outside Phoenix. She watched the other women board buses that would carry them to ships, carry them back across the ocean to a continent still smoking with recent fires. Anna waved from a window, her face showing fear and hope in equal measure. Even Liesel looked uncertain for once, stripped of her hard certainty, just an aging woman facing an unknown future. The desert sun beat down exactly as it had that first day, turning the air to shimmering glass, swallowing sound into vast emptiness. But Greta understood it differently now, understood that emptiness could be filled with things built deliberately, one small act at a time, one choice to treat people as human beings even when emotion argued against it, one refusal to let hatred perpetuate itself through another generation. The work ahead would be hard, heartbreaking, mostly invisible. She would translate pain into paperwork, help people search for the disappeared, watch families discover that their searches ended in graves more often than reunions. She would carry the weight of what her country had done, what she'd failed to prevent through ignorance or obedience or simple lack of courage to ask difficult questions when asking might have mattered. But she would also carry that first piece of steak that had tasted like truth, carry Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka's mechanical mercy that had somehow saved her from becoming what Liesel remained, carry the knowledge that restraint in the face of justified hatred might be the only thing capable of breaking cycles that otherwise ran on forever. She didn't have redemption, didn't expect forgiveness, didn't believe she deserved either. But she had purpose now, had work that needed doing, had the rest of her life to spend building the bridges Sarah had talked about between enemies who needed to become something else if the world was going to continue. The transport arrived precisely on schedule. Greta climbed aboard with her small bag and her dictionary and the weight of everything she'd learned. As the truck pulled away from Camp Florence, she didn't look back at the barracks or the mess hall or the theatre where she'd watched the films that had destroyed her old understanding of the world. She looked forward instead, toward whatever came next, toward the work of translation and reconnection and the slow, patient labor of helping rebuild what had been destroyed. It wouldn't be enough, could never be enough measured against the scale of what had been lost. But it would be real, would be hers, would be the best use she could imagine for the strange gift of having survived when so many hadn't. The desert swallowed the sound of the engine as they drove, the vast emptiness absorbing everything the way it always did, the way it always would, patient and pitiless and utterly indifferent to human suffering or human efforts to address that suffering. But Greta had learned that the emptiness didn't matter, that meaning came from the choosing to act anyway, from the decision to build something in the face of nothing, from the courage to let law and mercy reshape you even when every part of your training argued against it. She'd been Greta Hoffman, radio operator, believer in lies, survivor by accident. She would become Greta Hoffman, translator, bridge builder, someone who chose to remember both the stake and the newsreels, both the mercy she'd received and the horror that had required that mercy, both the grandmother who'd hanged herself rather than face a changed world, and the lieutenant who'd enforced law even when emotion demanded revenge. All of it together, held in tension, refusing the easy comfort of choosing only one truth over the others. The transport carried her toward Phoenix, toward her first displaced persons center, toward rooms full of people searching desperately for vanished loved ones, toward paperwork and regulations and the grinding bureaucracy of humanitarian relief, toward the rest of her life, whatever shape that would take, whatever she could make of the rubble and the ruins and the terrible gift of having been shown that mercy was possible even when it shouldn't be, that restraint could be chosen even when revenge was justified, that law could matter more than feeling if people decided to make it matter. She didn't know if that would be enough to outweigh what she carried, what she'd failed to prevent, what she'd been complicit in through ignorance and obedience. But it was what she had to offer, the only thing she could do with the life that remained to her. So she would offer it, day after day, one small act of translation and connection at a time, building bridges across the vast, destroyed landscape of post-war Europe, helping people find each other in the ruins, contributing whatever she could to the slow, patient work of reconstruction. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, empty and burning and indifferent. But Greta had learned to see possibility in that emptiness, to understand that you could build meaning even in the most barren landscape if you were willing to start small, work patiently, and remember that every large structure began with a single deliberate choice to place one stone on top of another and keep building even when the work seemed impossible. That's what she would do now. Build one stone at a time, one translated letter at a time, one reconnected family at a time, for as long as she had left, for whatever difference it might make.